By the autumn of 1863, the war had swallowed every gun the country could find. Federal armories ran day and night. Blockade runners smuggled rifles through southern ports, and farm boys marched off carrying whatever iron their fathers could spare. We're counting down 25 guns the Civil War was truly fought with, not the cannon of the history books, but the rifles, carbines, and revolvers that men loaded by hand and trusted to carry them through the next volley. Some were borrowed from foreign arsenals, some were built on stolen machinery. Which one earned the top spot? Let's begin. By 1862, the Confederacy was buying rifles by the shipload from Austria, and the Lorenz pattern became the second most common long arm of the entire war. Imported through brokers who cared nothing for which flag bought them, the Lorenz arrived in a maddening spread of bores, nominally .54 but often reamed out to .58 to swallow the standard Minié ball. A crate landed on the docks for roughly $14 a stand, more than a Union private earned in a month. Cheap enough that both governments grabbed everyone they could reach before the other side did. Soldiers cursed the foreign sights and the bores that never quite matched their cartridges, yet on a firing line with dry powder, the Lorenz held as well as anything made in Springfield. At Stone's River, men of the Army of Tennessee went into the cornfields with nothing else, their volleys indistinguishable from any other. It was the gun nobody bragged about and everybody fired. $12, a month's wages for a private, bought the government a rifle that had already proven itself a decade before Fort Sumter. The Model 1841, remembered everywhere as the Mississippi Rifle, marched into this war a respected veteran. Manufactured at the Harper's Ferry Armory and a dozen contractors from 1841 onward. It wore a browned barrel, a brass patchbox, and a reputation forged under Jefferson Davis and his Mississippi volunteers in the Mexican War. Riflemen prized its accuracy above almost anything in the early ranks, dropping a man at 300 yards, while the smoothbore muskets beside them struggled to reach 80. Many were rebored and resighted for the heavier Minié ball as the war's appetite grew. In the letters home, men wrote of cleaning the old rifle by firelight and trusting it the way they trusted little else in the ranks, old, proven, and quietly loved. The most imported rifle of the war came not from any American factory but from Britain, and a regiment that drew Enfields counted itself ready to fight. Nearly 900,000 pattern 1853 rifles crossed the Atlantic before the guns fell silent, running the blockade into Charleston and Wilmington for the South, and arriving openly through northern ports for the Union. At about $18 delivered, better than a private's monthly pay. The Enfield carried a .577 bore close enough to the Springfields to spare quartermasters their worst ammunition nightmares. A veteran might carry the same Enfield from First Manassas all the way to Appomattox, its walnut stock darkening with 4 years of rain and powder, never once wanting another. The London proof mark stamped into the lock told a quiet story of a domestic war fought with the whole world's iron. Many called it the finest musket either side issued, beloved by both armies without distinction. The machinery that built the next rifle had been carried off, in a sense, from the very armory whose seizure helped start the war. When Virginia forces took Harper's Ferry in April of 1861, they hauled the rifle-making equipment south to Richmond before the buildings burned to their foundations. From those captured tools came the Richmond rifle musket, the backbone of Confederate small arms production for the rest of the conflict. The distinctive humpback lock plate stamped with the Confederate eagle and the words C.S. Richmond marked a weapon born from Northern machines turned against the men who built them. It cost the Southern government about as much as any contract musket, though the collapse of Confederate currency made every example painfully dear by war's end. The Richmond Armory turned them out by the tens of thousands until the city fell in the spring of 1865. Forged on the enemy's own machines. Some of that same Harper's Ferry equipment traveled farther still, and the Fayetteville rifle was its other child. born in the old United States Arsenal at Fayetteville, North Carolina. The works there produced a clean, well-finished arm that many collectors still consider the handsomest Confederate long rifle of the war. Early examples carried a brass nose cap and a lock inherited from the captured Maynard pattern, before wartime shortages stripped away every ounce of brass in the name of speed. A single finished Fayetteville represented weeks of scarce skilled labor the South could barely spare, which made each one worth more than its price, in a currency that bought less every month. Confederate inspectors stamped and recorded them carefully, and a man who shouldered a Southern-made rifle instead of a stripped battlefield cast-off carried it with plain pride. The works ran until Sherman's men reached the town and burned it, polished, scarce, and Southern to the core. Breech loading was the future every army could see coming, and a handful of Confederate makers tried to seize it despite a hopeless want of tools and steel. The Cook and Brother carbine, built first in New Orleans and later in Athens, Georgia, stood among the most ambitious of those attempts, patterned loosely on the British Enfield, but cut down for a trooper on horseback. Every example cost the Confederate treasury a premium it could ill afford, and the brothers stamped each barrel with a defiant Confederate flag beside their own name. Federal raids and chronic shortages of iron dogged the works from the first day to the last, scattering production across 2 states. Georgia cavalrymen carried the Cook and Brother carbine late into the war, nursing it along long after broken parts had grown impossible to replace. A proud answer to an impossible problem. Ambitious, rare, and forever hunted by collectors. 40 Confederate dollars in a currency inflation was gutting by the month might buy a trooper the strangest gun on this stretch of the list. And by 1864, that sum bought less than a sack of flour. The Tarpley carbine, built in Greensboro, North Carolina from 1863, grew out of J. Tarpley's patent for a tipping breech that needed almost no precision machining at all. The South's answer to its crippling shortage of skilled tools. In theory, the design let a cavalryman load from the saddle faster than any muzzle loader on the field. In practice, the breech leaked hot gas into the firer's face, and the brittle metal cracked under the punishment of hard campaign use. Fewer than 400 are believed to have ever left the little shop before it closed, and the handful of soldier accounts that survive remember the gun without fondness, a brilliant idea the South could not quite build. A Union trooper who drew a Gallagher carbine learned to swear at it before he learned to trust it, yet the Army bought over 22,000 of them anyway. Manufactured by Richardson and Overman of Philadelphia from 1861, the Gallagher broke open like a shotgun to load a foil and paper cartridge, and the federal government paid roughly $25 for each, nearly 2 months of a private's pay. The trouble came after firing. The spent case swelled and jammed in the breech so stubbornly that cavalrymen took to carrying a knife for the sole purpose of prying it free between shots. For all its faults, the carbine put a .50 caliber ball downrange, and a mounted man with a breech loader still beat a man fumbling a ramrod from the saddle. On long patrols, Ohio and Pennsylvania troopers filed and bent their Gallaghers in camp just to keep them feeding through the next day. The most hated gun nobody could refuse. The Maynard carbine solved the very problem that plagued the Gallagher, and it did so with a brass cartridge a man could pick up off the ground, reload, and use again. Designed by the Washington dentist Edward Maynard and built in Massachusetts from the late 1850s. The Maynard tipped open at a lever to drop its metallic case neatly into a soldier's palm. The government paid around $23 apiece, close to 2 months' wages, and the carbine earned a loyal following for accuracy that shamed many longer arms. After a fight, frugal troopers crawled the firing line gathering their spent Maynard cases to hand load by firelight long after the issued ammunition ran dry. Confederate cavalrymen who captured one guarded it more jealously than almost any other carbine they could take. The brass case was decades ahead of its time, clean, accurate, and quietly brilliant. Few carbines fired anything as strange as the Smith, whose cartridge was wrapped in India rubber that stank when it burned. Patented by Gilbert Smith and produced in considerable numbers from 1861, the Smith broke at a hinge like a modern shotgun and sold to the government for roughly $24 each, the better part of 2 months' soldier pay. The rubber case sealed the breach against the gas leaks that tormented other designs, and over 30,000 reached Union cavalry hands before the war ended. Troopers grumbled about the acrid smoke and the price of the odd cartridges, but the action was simple and nearly soldier-proof. Screening the Army of the Potomac on the move, cavalrymen found the Smith still firing through mud and downpour when fussier guns had quit. A peculiar answer that simply worked, reliable, rubber-sealed, and strange. The carbine that armed more Union cavalrymen than any other cost the government around $25, almost 2 months of a trooper's wages, and worth it for a gun that rarely failed him. The Burnside, designed by the same Ambrose Burnside, who would later command the Army of the Potomac, fired a unique cone-shaped brass cartridge through a breech that tilted up at the touch of a lever. More than 50,000 were delivered, and whole divisions of horsemen rode into battle with the Burnside slung across their backs. The conical case sealed beautifully and rarely leaked, though its odd shape meant a trooper could load no other gun's ammunition into it. Through the grinding cavalry campaigns of 63 and 64, Eastern troopers came to count on the Burnside the way they counted on their horses. Its inventor failed as a general, but succeeded as a gunmaker, common, dependable, and everywhere at once. On a damp morning in a cavalry camp, a trooper could thumb a fresh round into his Joslyn and snap the breech shut before the man beside him had finished priming, for it was among the first metallic cartridge breech loaders the Union issued in number. Built by Benjamin Joslyn from the early 1860s and produced at Stonington, Connecticut, the carbine used a side-hinged breech block that swung open to take a rimfire round, and the government paid in the neighborhood of $23 for each, near 2 months' pay. The rimfire cartridge pointed straight toward the self-contained ammunition that would soon make muzzle loaders obsolete everywhere. Around 11,000 carbines reached Federal cavalry, and the men who carried them on the western rivers found the action quick under the hand, if rough at the edges. A genuine step into the future, early, swift, and forward-looking. The first revolver to earn its place on this list was not a Colt or a Remington, but the Starr, the third most issued sidearm of the entire Union war effort. The Starr Arms Company of New York built both a double-action and a simpler single-action model, and the government paid around $12 for each 6-shot .44. A single month's wages for the man who would carry it. The double action let a hard-pressed cavalryman fire as fast as he could pull the trigger, a real advantage in the chaos of a mounted melee, though many officers distrusted the complicated lockwork. More than 47,000 Starrs went to war on Federal hips and saddles. When a charge collapsed into a swirling fight at arm's length, troopers dropped the carbine on its sling and went to the Starr to settle it. Underrated then and overlooked now. The workhorse revolver history forgot. The Colt 1851 Navy was the revolver an officer wanted on his belt. A graceful .36 caliber 6-shooter that balanced in the hand like a fine tool. Samuel Colt's Hartford Works had been turning them out since 1850, and by the war the Navy had become the most admired cap-and-ball revolver in America, carried by generals and privates alike. It cost about $20 new, a sum that put it beyond a common soldier's reach, unless he took one from a fallen man or saved a month and a half of his pay. The .36 ball was lighter than the Army calibers, but the balance and the natural pointing of the grip made the Navy deadly accurate at the close ranges where revolver fights were settled. Wild Bill Hickok carried a pair butt forward for the rest of his life, drawing them in a reversed sweep that became legend. And he was only the most famous of thousands. Officers cleaned the Navy nightly by candlelight and guarded it above any other thing they owned in the field. Elegant, trusted, and endlessly copied. Heavier and harder hitting, the Colt 1860 Army became the standard sidearm of the Union cavalry and the most produced revolver of the entire war. Colt redesigned the frame to carry a full .44 caliber load on a streamlined grip that still pointed as sweetly as the Navy it replaced, and the government bought well over 100,000 of them. Each cost the Army around $14 on contract, about a month's soldier pay. Cheaper than the civilian price, because Colt sold them by the tens of thousands. The .44 ball gave a mounted trooper the stopping power the lighter Navy lacked, a real consideration when a single shot from the saddle had to end a fight. From Gettysburg to the Western Plains, Union horsemen rode with the 1860 Army riding in thousands of belt holsters, the bluing rubbing to silver where the leather wore it. The fluted and round-barreled variants told collectors which year a gun was born. The revolver that armed the Union's horsemen. The Remington New Model Army of 1863 offered something the Colt could not: a solid frame with a top strap over the cylinder, stronger and simpler than anything Hartford built. Eliphalet Remington's Ilion, New York, Works produced a rugged .44 that many soldiers came to prefer, and the government paid between $12 and $15 apiece, roughly a month's wages, slightly less than the Colt. The top strap meant a Remington could take abuse that loosened or bent a Colt's open-top frame, and cavalrymen who lived hard on campaign valued that toughness above elegance. Veterans carried spare loaded cylinders in a belt pouch and swapped them in seconds, back in the fight while the Colt man beside them still fumbled with powder and ball. Strong, simple, and soldier-proof. Behind Confederate lines, in a small Georgia town, a converted cotton gin factory turned out brass-framed copies of the Colt Navy under the name Griswold and Gunnison. Samuel Griswold's works at Griswoldville produced roughly 3,600 revolvers, the most of any Confederate handgun maker, each one a near copy of the .36 Navy adapted to whatever the blockaded South could find. Brass replaced the scarce iron in the frame, giving these revolvers their distinctive golden receivers, and a finished example cost the Confederate government several times what a Northern Colt did once inflation had finished with the currency. The quality rose and fell with the skill of impressed workmen and the grade of smuggled steel, but a Griswold fired as deadly a ball as any Navy when it counted. The factory itself died the day Union cavalry rode into Griswoldville in late 1864 and put it to the torch. Brass-framed, scarce, and defiantly Southern. Imported through the blockade in wooden crates, the Kerr revolver armed Confederate cavalry officers who could lay hands on one of the few English handguns to reach Southern shores in number. Made by the London Armory Company, the Kerr was a 5-shot percussion revolver of unusual side-hammer design, and each one cost the Confederacy dearly in the scarce hard currency it took to run a crate past the Federal Navy. Its 5 chambers held one fewer shot than a Colt, but the English fit and finish were a cut above most of what the South could build for itself. An officer who drew a Kerr from a smuggled case carried it as a mark of standing, a well-made foreign arm in a war of rough domestic copies, imported, refined, and rare. The most dangerous gun a man could shoulder on this list was not aimed at the enemy at all, but at the soldier firing it. The Colt 1855 revolving rifle promised the firepower of a revolver in a long arm, 5 or 6 shots before reloading at a time when every other rifle gave only 1. And the government bought several thousand at around $44 each, twice the price of a musket, and better than 3 months of a private's pay. For that money, a soldier got a weapon that could chain fire, igniting every chamber at once and blowing the cylinder apart inches from the hand bracing the forestock. Men learned to fire it with the supporting arm drawn back behind the cylinder, and many quietly traded it away for anything else they could find. Bourdon's marksmen carried them early before switching to Sharp's rifles they trusted with their fingers. Brilliant in theory, terrifying in practice. The firepower nobody wanted to hold. 9 shots and a load of buckshot made the LeMat the strangest revolver any officer carried into this war. Designed by the New Orleans physician Jean-Alexandre LeMat and manufactured in France and England for the Confederacy from 1861, the LeMat held 9.42 caliber rounds in a cylinder that rotated around a second short barrel loaded with buckshot, like a miniature shotgun slung beneath the bore. A flip of the hammer's nose chose which barrel fired. Each imported example cost the Confederate government a small fortune in scarce specie run through the blockade, and only a few thousand ever reached Southern hands. Generals Beauregard and J.E.B. Stuart both carried one, lending the grapeshot revolver a fame far beyond its numbers. The men who watched a cavalry officer empty his 9 balls, thumb the lever down, and loose a charge of buckshot at point-blank range never forgot the sight. Exotic, fearsome, and unmistakably Confederate. The shot that killed a Union general came from a hexagonal bore, and the Whitworth rifle made the impossible look routine. The English engineer Joseph Whitworth designed a barrel with a twisted hexagonal bore that gripped a matching bolt-shaped bullet, and his rifles, imported by the Confederacy from 1862, could strike a man at distances that left ordinary muskets useless. Fitted with a telescopic sight, a single Whitworth cost the South many times the price of any other rifle in either army, making it the costliest small arm of the war. At Spotsylvania in 1864, a Confederate marksman with a Whitworth killed General John Sedgwick at a range his own staff had sworn was safe. Moments after Sedgwick mocked the enemy's aim and told his men they could not hit an elephant at that distance. Confederate sharpshooter battalions guarded their few Whitworths like crown jewels, the rifle that rewrote the limits of distance. A Sharps in the hands of a trained marksman could fire 10 aimed shots a minute, and that speed made it the chosen rifle of the Union's elite. Christian Sharp's falling block breechloader, built in Hartford and chambered for a linen or paper .52 caliber cartridge, let a soldier load and fire lying flat behind cover. A revolution at a time when reloading meant standing to ram a ball down a muzzle. The government paid around $30 apiece, more than 2 months of a private's wages, and worth every cent to the men who carried one. Colonel Hiram Bourdon armed his 2 regiments of United States sharpshooters with the Sharps, and their green-coated marksmen picked off artillery crews and officers at ranges the enemy had believed impossible, unnerving whole batteries before a charge. Fast, accurate, and feared down the whole length of a line. It was never the gun of legend, and that is exactly why it mattered most. The Springfield Model 1861 rifle musket was the weapon the Civil War was actually fought with, the plain iron that filled the hands of more soldiers in more battles than every glamorous repeater and imported marvel combined. Made at the Springfield Armory and by dozens of contractors, more than 1 million were produced, each costing the government around $20. A month and a half of the wages paid the men who carried it into the fire. Its .58 caliber Minié ball, fired from a rifled barrel, turned massed infantry assaults into slaughter, and wrote the brutal arithmetic of Antietam and Gettysburg in blood. A trained man could load and fire 3 aimed shots a minute, and across 4 years, that humble rhythm decided the fate of the nation. When you picture the rifle standing on 1,000 stone monuments, you are picturing this one, the gun that truly fought the war, Then came the weapon that pointed straight past this war into every one that followed. The Spencer repeating carbine, Suspension klarer Serpentine tarbar, designed by Christopher Spencer and adopted by the Union from 1863, held 7 metallic cartridges in a tube through the buttstock, letting a cavalryman fire as fast as he could work the lever and cock the hammer. Each cost the government around $25, near 2 months of a trooper's pay, and President Lincoln himself test-fired one on the grass near the White House before throwing his weight behind its adoption. At Hoover's Gap, Union infantry armed with Spencers broke a Confederate attack with a wall of fire the Southern ranks could not understand or answer. The men who faced it called it the rifle. The Yankees loaded on Sunday and fired all week. 7 shots changed everything. The repeater that broke the old rules. And at the top of the list stands the Henry, the rifle that fired 16 rounds without reloading when every enemy musket fired 1. Benjamin Tyler Henry's lever-action repeater, built by the New Haven Arms Company from 1860, fed a .44 rimfire cartridge from a tube beneath the barrel, and a man who filled it could loose 16 shots in under a minute. At around $40, it cost a soldier nearly 3 months' pay, so most who carried one bought it themselves out of their own pockets, prizing it above any arm the Army could issue. Confederate troops who faced the Henry spoke of it with something close to dread. That damned Yankee rifle a man could load on Sunday and shoot all week. From the borrowed Austrian muskets that opened this list to the 16-shooter that closed it, the war had crossed an entire age in 4 years. The men who carried a Henry into the last battles understood they held the future in their hands, a weapon that made the single-shot musket a relic overnight, and every army on earth would soon chase what it proved possible. From the humblest imported cast-off to the rifle that ended the age of the single shot, these were the guns that truly fought the Civil War. Not the cannon on the courthouse lawn, but the iron in a soldier's hands when the next volley came. The gun that ended one era and began the next.